Two more presentations for you now, and then we'll do a question and answer again at the end. The first is from Clare Watson. She's a behaviour change researcher at UCC. She's studied social science and social work at Trinity College, and over the years she's worked on many community projects and environmental campaigns. She's a PhD student at UCC, working on an EPA-funded project that's analysing why people engage or not with local initiatives on climate mitigation and adaptation. And she's well able to talk to you about human behaviour. She has a 12-year-old son from whom she's learned a lot about human behaviour. So very well qualified as well. Claire, I'll invite you to the podium.
As Jim said, I'm doing the PhD in UCC, the title Climate Change, Behaviour and Community Response. It's a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary project funded by the EPA. It's a 3-year project which started in January and goes on until December 2017. We're looking primarily at communities and what works and doesn't work in relation to community involvement on energy and climate issues. It's an interesting topic. I'll tell you, I'm going to give you a little bit of overview. So initially I'm going to talk about myself. We all like talking about ourselves. So you'll hear a bit about my background and what brought me to this topic. And then I'm going to try and answer the question, why are we finding it so hard to react to climate change and energy insecurity? And then we'll be looking at how we can encourage energy efficiency. Like the former speakers have said, there's no silver bullet, and I can't say that I have all the answers. But over the years, I think I've gained a little bit of experience from my personal experience, and as I say, also from watching teenagers. So I have a background in social science and social work, and in 1999, my then partner and I moved to Bantry in West Cork to live the good life. And we bought a farm. We built a straw bale house, which is very comfortable, powered by a wind generator, solar panels, and a wood-burning stove. We bought an electric car, and we tried to grow as much of our own food as possible. Ever the evangelists, we set out then to spread the word. We actually turned up on Duncan Stewart's programme for 5 minutes. And we tried to, in 2008, set up a group which would develop Bantry as an energy-efficient flagship town. Sad to say, we failed miserably in converting the masses to our low-carbon lifestyle. And I can see why. It was physically tough and it was isolating. So 2 years ago, I left the farm. And I'm now in a beautifully renovated bungalow, which now has a heat pump. It has solar photovoltaics, a heat recovery ventilation system, and loads of insulation. I'm hoping that this is a better version of the better life, the good life. It's certainly easier. There's more PVC and less vegetable growing. While I was thinking about my own experience of having had such a, it was very intensive, the lifestyle we'd chosen, I was frustrated why other people weren't taking on even some of the actions that we were trying to do, and I began to really think it through. And I started researching myself, and then in 2012 I put together a number of articles and I put them up on a website. And I was hoping that it would encourage people, particularly in the environmental movement, where a lot of my experience had been, to kind of discuss the issues. And I think it's brought me to the topic and to the PhD that I'm doing now. Now, we are a tricky species, and our heads rule our hearts, emotion can trump reason, and we're often irrational. As Daniel Gilbert says, if global warming were caused by eating puppies, millions of Americans would be massing in the streets. So what I'm going to do today is go through this list. Why is it so hard for us to react? If we mine deeper, we can see there are many other factors which make it challenging for us to respond effectively, particularly in relation to our energy use, which is what we're discussing today. As Pete told us, loss aversion is a big issue. Most of us dislike sacrifice and we hate losses. Roughly speaking, losing something makes us twice as unhappy as gaining the same thing makes us happy. So telling people to cut back or to cut it out may not work. As Pete said, Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated that loss aversion can lead to risk aversion. And they've shown that people behave in different ways depending on whether the risk is presented in terms of losses or gains. The endowment effect is a term coined by US behavioral economist Richard Thaler to describe the hypothesis that people value something more once their property right to it has been established. So we place a higher value on something that we own relative to objects belonging to someone else. So it's mine, don't take it away from me, a bit like the toddler with a toy. The status quo bias assumes that the loss of what we already have looms larger than the gain of an alternative option. As a general rule, people are conservative because they do not want to lose the gains they have already made, and they may view attempts to change as potentially risky. So asking people to get rid of the oil guzzling heating system may be quite a challenge. The year whatever heuristic comes to play, and that means what we're doing, we continue to do because of lethargy or lack of attention. So don't bother to make the required change. Individuals like myself find it hard to switch energy suppliers, and we succumb to automatic renewal of magazine subscriptions. Sure, aren't we grand the way we are? One way to overcome this is to design an option as the default and to nudge people into action. We're also influenced by sunk costs. That means that we invest financially, emotionally, or socially in something. The less we are then likely to give it up. People have a psychological need to persist and achieve despite what may seem like overwhelming odds. And the more time, effort, and resources invested in the venture, the harder it is to relinquish, even if it becomes clear that the prognosis is not looking good. For instance, we might buy an SUV, and then we hear that energy-efficient cars are all the rage, but we spent a lot of money on our SUV. So what we do is then we tell people how good it is, it's very safe, it's good for the kids, don't we have to carry a trailer anyway? And then we may even drive it more just to prove how useful it is. We can be optimistic individuals. We believe that we're less likely to experience a negative outcome compared to others. Cold winter coming up? Nah, sure, that won't affect me. Price hikes, energy price hikes, won't happen. Sure, and if it does, I'll be fine. And finally, we have a tendency to screen what is seen and heard in a biased way that ensure that our beliefs are proven correct. So we accept facts that support our view while rejecting or ignoring information that conflicts with it. Behavioral patterns can also determine how we act. We can be influenced by addictions which give us short-term pleasure and make us crave for more. Some of us are addicted to shopping, to gathering stuff, or traveling long distances to climb high mountains. George Bush reckoned we're addicted to oil, and addictions are hard to break. Much of our day-to-day life is controlled by habits. These are routine behaviors carried out almost unconsciously on a regular basis, like driving the car, leaving the lights on, or the tap running while washing our teeth. Habits are hard to break. We can become habituated to a way of being. We get used to it, take it for granted, and then find it hard to give up. And we continue to expect it to be like this regardless. In the past, room temperatures were cold. We were fine huddling around the one open fire, and with, if we were lucky, a storage heater in the hall. Now we want to wear our T-shirts in every room. This reminds me of the Des Bishop joke. How do you know in the 1980s that you were going out with an Irish girl? She'd wake up in the middle of the night, oh my God, I left the immersion on. Now we want hot water all the time. And we're so used to having electricity at the flick of a switch, many of us couldn't imagine how it would be without it. So maybe we actually need a few grid crashes to wake us up to what a precious resource we have. And most of us are good adapters. Although it can take a while for some, we are able to adjust to new information and experiences. We adopt new behaviours that allow us to cope with change, which is a good trait to have when facing future climate-related difficulties or crises. But it's not so good when it comes back to cutting our energy use. Just as addicts adapt to their drug, when we adapt to pleasurable experiences or things, we want more. For instance, we adapted to having a TV box in our living rooms. Now we want massive 65-inch flat-screen TVs in the living room with smaller versions in each bedroom. Despite all my parental eco-training, my teenage son still gets into the car, and in the summer he presses the button for the air conditioning, and in the winter for the heater, and he won't take on or off his jumper. And there's no way he'll wear a coat. How we respond to issues can be heavily influenced by our need to conform both socially and culturally. A society is able to function partly because of social and cultural norms. Even though the rules aren't written down, we know how we should act. We don't walk around naked or pick our noses in public. And if we break the rules, we feel embarrassed, ashamed, or guilty. It's a problem if these norms aren't climate or energy friendly, but a plus if they are. Fairness is important to us, and we judge it in a relative way, usually in comparison with our peers or social equals. We don't want to do more than others, and we are even less likely to act if we believe that people are free-riding and benefiting from doing nothing. This can arise when collective outcomes hinge on decisions taken by individuals. So what difference can I make? Why should I take the hit if my neighbours are doing nothing? And anyway, what are America and China doing? We're social beings, and we have a deep need to belong and to be part of the group, so peer pressure is important to us. The psychologist Judith Rich Harris upset the child development world when in the late 1990s she stated that apart from passing on their genes, parents have little influence on their children, except to choose their child's peer group. And she went on to advise that the only way of rescuing a kid who is heading for trouble is to get him out of the neighbourhood and away from his delinquent peers. Groups use peer pressure to encourage conformity. We don't want to be marked out as different and risk social ridicule. So keeping up with the Joneses is important. And if the Joneses aren't doing anything about their energy use, sure, why would we? Our identity is made up of characteristics that define us, who we think we are, and how we like to be seen by others. And we usually hold values that fit in with that identity, essentially a personal moral code of what is right or wrong. So if my identity is green, then I'm more likely to watch my energy use. If I see myself as a humanitarian, I'll be focusing on how best to help people and may have no time left over to worry about energy efficiency. So don't presume that one leads to the other. Our social status is important to most of us, even though we might not like to admit it. It's an evolutionary trait which refers to the prestige attached to one's position in society or to a rank held within a certain group. The contemporary philosopher Alain de Botton described status as a worry so pernicious as to be capable of ruining extended stretches of our lives. A high position on the social ladder corresponds to improved access to financial, physical, sexual, social, and informational resources, which in turn will help protect long-term interests. We don't want to end up at the bottom of the ladder. Status is often displayed by what people do or what they own. That's why many of us want to be seen driving a fancy sports car, or at least a car that the cool people drive. Interestingly, Tesla and Toyota have marketed their electric and hybrid cars with this in mind. Tesla designs slick, sporty electric vehicles and charges accordingly. Toyota launched its Prius by lending a number of vehicles to A-list celebrities and then encouraging them to drive and to be seen driving around LA. And quite a few Priuses were driven to that year's Oscars. We like to think that people will leap into action when the chips are down, but we're not so good at responding if no one else does. You probably heard of the bystander effect. When people are in a group, responsibility for acting is diffused. If no one else is doing anything, we convince ourselves that the apparent problem isn't actually a problem. The effect was recognized in the 1960s when a woman, Kitty Genovese, was brutally murdered in America. Yet none of the onlookers did anything. In order to demonstrate why people do nothing in cases like this, researchers staged emergencies of one kind or another in different situations and then watched what happened. In one, they had a student alone in a room stage an epileptic fit. When there was just one person next door listening, that person rushed to the student's aid 85% of the time. But when subjects thought that there were 4 others also overhearing the seizure, they came to the student's aid only 31% of the time. If the subject was in a room with other people who were actually also not responding, they did nothing. So if there's a lack of leadership and it seems like government ministers are doing nothing about climate change or the energy transition, if we don't hear about it in the media, in the local pub, or down at the shops, sure, how can it be such a threat? Why should we bother doing anything? Why should we be the ones to jump first? We have to be very careful, though, not to focus solely on individual behaviour change. How we behave is also determined by other factors outside of our control. And it's important that we don't set up individuals to fail and then blame them for it. Social practice, as we've already heard, is what people do to pursue a goal within certain settings. It's often determined by social norms or status and can be seen as an outside force which determines what we do. As Elizabeth Shove puts it, if there is to be any substantial and effective reduction in greenhouse emissions, new forms of living, working and playing will have to take hold. For instance, it's not okay to wear woolly jumpers, and I see a lot of chilly suits here, so we crank up the heat. Kids need to be in clean clothes, so on with the washing machine. We drive our kids to school because of the heavy school bags and the unsafe roads, and we don't want to be seen as bad parents. Social and cultural developments can influence how much energy we use and where we use it. For instance, the emancipation of women has led to more marriage separations, so 2 houses instead of 1, and more energy use. The importance of personal hygiene means more bathrooms, power showers, washing machines, and more energy use. Institutional barriers can play their part in stymieing change, such as fragmented policy at local and national levels, organisational opposition, system lock-in, political inertia, lack of leadership and joined-up thinking, and lack of funding. New technologies will have their own unintended effects. For instance, the introduction of trains made it possible for people to live outside cities and commute to work. The introduction of the car further developed the suburban sprawl and has led to the car-dependent lifestyle we have today. In November 2001, after the bombing of the Twin Towers, a special Concorde flight brought celebrities like Sting to New York. Mayor Giuliani greeted them at Kennedy Airport, saying that the bonds which have always bound together London and New York have been cemented even more following the disastrous events of September. Then, as they left the plane, he invited them to spend, spend, spend. We live in a consumer culture, and continuing economic growth seems to require that we shop till we drop. If we waver, relentless advertising and rapidly changing fashion trends will bring us back on track. Within this context, asking people to consume less is a tall order. Apparently, Franklin D. Roosevelt was asked what book he would give the Soviets to teach them about the advantages of American society. He pointed to the Sears catalogue. Planned obsolescence is a problem in that products, despite being energy efficient, are designed not to last, so energy is wasted in manufacture. There is also a danger that when people replace the appliance, they upgrade to a bigger version. Feature creep refers to the ongoing expansion or addition of new features to a product. So you feel you have to have the latest model to keep up with the changes. So again, energy is lost in manufacture. So there's a couple of other things we have to be aware of, and we've gone through the rebound effect. I'll just add another point that you may get the point that you save money and you're not to kind of use more energy, but you may use that saved money then on a long-haul flight to somewhere exotic. So for the overall issue, it depends where that money is spent. The Diderot effect shows how buying one thing can spawn a series of purchases. It's named after the 18th century French philosopher Denis Diderot, who wrote about receiving a new dressing gown as a gift from a friend and how it compelled him to redecorate his entire study. The new dressing gown made everything in the room look old and shabby by comparison, and item by item, everything was replaced to match his dressing gown. He regretted the gift. The Diderot effect is not good for energy efficiency or conservation. For instance, we might decide to build a sunroom and we open the doors and we sit out, or we open the doors, we step out onto a muddy patch, so we build a patio. Then we sit on the patio and we look at the messy garden, so we decide we need to do some landscaping. And before we know it, we've bought a ride-on mower, a patio heater, a gas-fired barbecue, and we've got the electrician to install more outside lights. Many people are nervous of new technologies and unwilling to adopt them, even if they know they'll improve their quality of life, save money, or save the planet. Hands up, I'm a bit of a technophobe myself, but I'm also an early adopter, so I wing it. And as a woman, I can get away with this because I've techie friends who jump in to help me when I need it. It must be much harder for non-techie men. Most people believe that when the price is right, people respond, and to some extent this is true, but it may not be the whole story. I was talking to a retired schoolmaster friend of mine recently and asked him what he thought would encourage people to retro-insulate their homes. He said the cost, of course. Then we got talking about the topic of open fires versus wood-burning stoves. And he said, oh, he'd love to have one, but sure, his wife wouldn't have it. She loves looking at the open flames. So I said, well, what about if you tell her that there's some energy savings? And he said, that wouldn't work. So don't understand the importance of communication. What people hear about the issue, how they hear about it, and from whom is crucially important. So there's a number of messages that don't work. As we heard from Pete, information on its own isn't useful. We campaigners used to think that you just had to give people the facts And then, of course, they'd respond. And if they don't react the first time, you just shout louder. But information about climate change and its potential impacts, how to cut emissions, how to conserve energy, and how to be more energy efficient has been available now for years. Yet we're still struggling, as we see, to respond effectively. Many studies now show that the simple information in, action out approach on its own does not work. Fostering awareness of a problem, the threat it represents, its causes, and what can be done about it will not necessarily lead to the desired response. In fact, one study says that merely obtaining information can have a counterintuitive effect in that individuals can view getting the information about a problem as having acted on it. So they've done something, they listened. We also need to be aware of negative messaging, and campaigners in the environmental movement, myself included in the past, have been very good at letting people know how bad it's going to get if we don't act now. So the apocalypse is now, the impacts will be catastrophic, and my favourite, millions will die. But it's not clear that negative messages work. They, in fact, can also be counterproductive. Threat information causes constructive responses and persistent attitude change only when people feel personally vulnerable to the risk, when they know what to do about it, when the cost is acceptable, and they feel that their response will be effective in solving the problem. If a person's reaction only aims to control the fear or pain without reducing the danger, such a response is deemed maladaptive. According to Moser and Dilling, avoidant behaviours include denial of the existence of the threat or that it will have any impact, blaming others, rationalising that silver bullet solutions will be found, or refusing to do anything different and succumbing to apathy. We should remember that Martin Luther King didn't stir people by proclaiming, "I have a nightmare." Also, the 10 things you can do approach can be problematic as it comes up against the problem of scale. If the threat seems too big and too global, then people feel disempowered. How will changing my light bulbs help? Instead, we need a more positive, hopeful vision of the future. I have a dream. We need a vision that isn't hopelessly unobtainable and which doesn't necessarily require grinding sacrifice. This vision requires a new mood appropriate for the world we hope to create. It should be a mood of gratitude, joy, and pride, not one of sadness, fear, and regret. But we also need to be wary of bright-siding and avoiding reality and the challenges we face. As author Barbara Ehrenreich points out, realism to the point of defensive pessimism is a prerequisite not only for human survival, but for all animal species. So it's a fine balance. Many say that messages directed at individuals in isolation have little effect. We need to know that we're part of a bigger plan and not acting on our own. So external support is important from peer groups, from our social norms and institutions, and enabling infrastructure. The most effective strategies are those that engage people in groups, as Ruth was saying earlier on. We also need to be mindful of who we're talking to. We often tend to treat people as a homogeneous group who will hear and respond to messages in the same way. But reality is very different. People have different mindsets and they hold diverse ideological and worldviews. Issues are not seen only on their merits, but rather get filtered through each person's belief system. For instance, in the US, Democrats are far more likely to believe in climate change than their Republican counterparts. As Cass Sunstein, former advisor to Barack Obama and proponent of the nudge theory, says, the message may also be seen in a different way because the messenger is perceived to have certain beliefs or worldviews. And we may attach all kinds of assumptions to what they say based on our impression of them. For instance, the messenger may have an identity or image that is not to everyone's liking. So if a long-haired hippie says something about climate change, a West Cork farmer would be less likely to take it seriously than if it came from another farmer. We're more likely to be persuaded to act in new ways if the message comes from a trusted source. In general, personally familiar sources are more trusted, and we believe that those coming from similar circumstances will understand our situation better than those from very different backgrounds. So we need to pick any spokespeople with care. Tone is also very important. Does the message come across as judgmental or preachy? People are super sensitive to being blamed. They hate being judged and are likely to backlash against whoever they think is doing the judging. According to the American Psychological Association, attempts to shame individuals into adopting pro-environmental behaviours can be ineffective, as they often lead to rationalizations of behaviour. I'm doing it because. And finally, we need to be careful how we frame the message and the words we use. George Lakoff makes the point by saying, don't think of an elephant. And what do we think of but an elephant? So bear in mind, telling people don't do this, don't do that, may actually have the opposite effect. So, nearing to an end. When I read a book, I always flick to the end and say, what's the solution? My God, how do we deal with all of this? So I'm afraid I don't have all the answers. And I'm sure the other speakers probably have more experience than me and have better answers than I have. And I'm very aware there's so many layers and potential banana skins. But maybe we don't or can't have the perfect approach. Whatever is done may be a bit hit and miss anyway, but we certainly can't do nothing. I love the title of a book I have, which is called Clumsy Solutions for a Complex World. So there's no silver bullet, we can only do our best. But I do think we need more leadership on the issue and a national plan. People need to know they're doing something within a context. They don't want to be doing it on their own. Any approach should be multifaceted. We can't rely solely on a marketing drive or grants. It's more effective if we work with people in groups and at a local level. It's best to pinpoint the changes that need to be made and then target them separately. Don't expect one behaviour change to necessarily lead to another. We should identify behavioural, social and institutional barriers and try to change or work around them. As we've said already, there is no one size that fits all, so we need to understand our audience and tailor any approaches accordingly. Adequate funding should be allocated, and we need to evaluate and learn from past mistakes. Thank you.